again, welcome to our event. And we are hosting today very important guests. Two of them are actually part of our Stanford family. But we have Kerim Abdulrahman from all the way UK. He is the translator of a Kurdish novel, The Last Pomegranate Tree, which is displayed over here. And he is the translator and the first Kurdish novel translator. And he is going to be accompanied by our very own Kelda Jamison and Evan Karakurd. Kelda is at Stanford Humanities Center, and Evan is a graduate student in comparative literature. And we also thank Stanford Humanities Center as well as the Department of Comparative Literature for co-hosting this event. Thank you, and I'm now happy to meet you.
Thank you so much. Khairin, Khairatin, Khairame, Khwashatin, to welcome you in many different Kurdish language varieties. Thank you all for being here and joining us for this book talk with Mamousseh Karim Abdulrahman about the politics of literature and translation, a Kurdish translator's journey. This event would not be possible without the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies. Thank you so much for the immense support in sponsoring and organizing this event. Thank you to Halil Nibin and Ali Arjolu. We also appreciate the support of the co-sponsors, the Stanford Humanities Center and the Content Department. We are so thrilled to have Mamousseh Karim here at Stanford with us. He's the translator of Bakhtiar Ali's novel, The Last Pomegranate Tree, copies of which can be bought at the beautiful book table over there. Thank you to the Stanford Bookstore at this moment in time. Karim was also the translator, as Halil has mentioned, of the reportedly first Kurdish novel to be translated into English ever, and this was only 7 years ago, in 2016. This was translated, as I said, at the Night of the City. Thus, Karim is, as of now, a very solitary expert in the field of literary translation from Kurdish into English. And we are grateful he's here to talk to us about his journey and discuss with us the politics of literature and translation in the Kurdish context. To introduce him a bit more, apart from being a literary translator, he's also a journalist and a Kurdish affairs analyst. He's worked as a Kurdish media and political analyst for the BBC, where translation was also part of his scope. He is also the head of editorial at Inside Iraq, a political analysis service focusing on Iraq and Kurdish affairs, and he's currently London-based. I apologize for having a laptop here. We had a slight printer malfunction, so I hope you forgive us for this.
So we wanted to start just quickly to give you a sense of the flow of the evening. We're going to start with a very necessarily brief and inexhaustive and inadequate and frustrating overview of Kurdish language, Kurdish politics, Kurds, just to sort of have a starting point for those who are less familiar with the region and the languages. It will be all of those things, too short and exhaustive, but a brief foray that will bear your forbearance for that, and then we'll hand it over to Mamousseh Karim for reading and discussion, and there will be ample time for Q&A. Please feel free, make yourselves at home. This is your home, so eat and drink and buy books and just let the spirit here be one of collegial, collaborative conversation. We have a guest of honor, and he's a delight. We've gotten to spend the whole day with him, and we're really happy to give you all a chance to get to know him as well. So please do be comfortable. So on the Hameen and I went back and forth on whether we should have a slide, whether we should have maps. We went on and on. The original brief version that we had spread over several single-space pages. It's very difficult to talk about a single Kurdish, but it's also become something that the varieties of Kurdish and the histories of people who call themselves Kurds are spread over nation states and different histories. They're spread over different scripts. There's no easy mapping thanks to colonialism and war and lots of the political developments of the past 200 years. There's no easy way to even map the people who speak and understand each other, whether or not they can read the same thing that the other said, whether or not they can have linguistic siblings who are close linguistically but live in a farther country on another side of a mountain with several different nation states in between. And so as we speak and as we talk this evening about the sort of politics of translation, know that there is always, it's both overdetermined and also hard to overstate just how those histories have shaped what we can talk about when we talk about Kurdish. So Kurmanji, which is Kurmanji is the variety spoken most widely among Kurds. It's the version spoken most widely in what is called Turkey and in parts of Iraq and Syria. The novel that we are reading and discussing today was written in Sorani, which is in southern Kurdistan, the most prominent. There's Zazaki and Gorani, which are spoken also in what is Turkey and parts of Iran. And yeah, so the story goes. We'll leave that for now, but we wanted to set that frame up to talk a bit about translation and why it matters specifically for sort of the heart of the topic of today, which is translation itself and how do we think about translation and world literature. I'm going to get back to Hedin.
Thank you, Kelda. Yes, so why is all of this important to talk about translation? I think in transitioning to giving Namaste Karim the floor finally, it's important to stress that the pursuit of nationhood of all of these different states that Kelda has mentioned, that went hand in hand with different forms of linguistic policies and most of all repressions aimed at the different Kurdish language varieties. So this led inevitably to a politicization of the language and following also to the politicization of any verbal art, be it in the form of music or in the form of written texts, literature. So while it might not be a political act to write a novel as such, it's a political act to write a Kurdish novel and inherently a political act to translate a Kurdish novel on multiple levels. And I'm sure we will talk about many of these levels in the discussion, and I don't want to say too much now. But before we get into all of that, let us have Karim fill our ears with the sound of the original language in Sorani, which he agreed to do for us and to read for us. And then he'll read the corresponding passage. It's the opening passage of the book also in his English translation. Just even if you're not familiar or if you've maybe never ever heard it before, let your ears have a taste. And Namaste Karim has also agreed to give us a short overview over the book of the plot, what it's about in general, because we haven't actually said anything about that yet. And with this, turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming here, and thank you very much for the university for having me. I'll try to give you a summary of the book. One of the things I often say about Bakhtiari's books is that it's quite difficult to summarize because usually you have many stories within stories, but I'll try nonetheless. So the last pomegranate tree is, in essence, the story of a man, Muzaffar Suhdam, who was a Peshmerga fighter, a Kurdish fighter in the roughly 1980s under Saddam. He gets arrested, he spends 21 years in prison in solitary confinement in a desert prison. During his time in prison, he goes on a lot of reflection, he thinks about the world, the way he looks at the world goes through a massive transformation. One of the things that he often thinks about is his only son, who was an infant of a few days old when he was arrested. And then he also thinks about how everything is related and what does it mean to live in the world, and he forgets a lot of his memories. When he is released, it's a point in the 1990s where the Kurds in Iraq have come to power, and one of his closest friends is the leader of the Kurdish region at this point, whose name is Snowber. So he goes to this man who was his friend before he was arrested, to whom he had given the care of his son. He says, "Where is my son, Sarias Subatam?" And he initially tries to tell him, I don't want you to get out to the world. I just want you to stay in a mansion I've built for you in the mountains. Because the world has become a dirty place, it's full of corruption, full of bad things, and you are someone who kept his innocence because you were in the prison for so long. I don't want you to go out to the world again. And he says, no, I do want to go out, and I want you to tell me about my son and where my son is. He doesn't tell him. It emerges later that Snowbird himself has had 2 legitimate sons in the same period, but he didn't want this to come out to the public, so he has given the same name to all 3 boys. So now we have 3 boys, Sayasi Subahtam, all have the same name. And this, our narrator goes on this journey to find his son, and in the process he finds 3 different people with the same name, same age, and he doesn't know really which one might be his son, might not be. And through telling their stories, we get to know what the region has gone through in those 20 years when he was away, and then after that, and each has a particular story to tell. But like a lot in Bakhtiar's books, we also have a situation where we have a lot of universal themes. So themes of what fatherhood. What's fatherhood? Is it just a biological thing? If you have a blood relation to someone, does that make you a father? Or is it more than that? The idea of why revolutions fail, or do they work? And why revolutionaries, when they come to power, they might not really adhere to the things they were advocating before. The book has 1 foot in reality, in modern Kurdish history, 1 foot in fantasies, and Bakhtiar again is quite famous for this. There's a magical realist element to his writing that's very beautiful. So we have a character, for example, whose heart is made of glass, literally, and his name is Muhammad the Glass-Hearted, Muhammad ibn Shusha. This boy who grew up under Saddam, he has this fascination with the world. He just wants everything to be transparent, but he wants no secrets to be there. And it comes from this place where he lived under a dictatorship, where everything was a secret, where you had to whisper everything, and there were so many walls between people, real and metaphoric walls. So this guy has this fascination with the world. First, he wants to break all the secrets, but also he wants things to be transparent. So you have things like this, which takes you to a different direction, and it's something that is universal. So even if you are not very familiar with the history of the Kurds, of this particular time in history, I think you will still be able to enjoy the book because of these elements. Of course, there is much more to say about the book, but I think I'll stop here and read from the Kurdish and the English after that. So this is from the opening page of the book. من البيان يكم وزانين كديري كذا لكوش كذا لناو جنگل دارستاني كنا دياردا أو بيقولتم لدر ودردي تكشن دي وقتاهم بلاو كدروي دكر باو دكان همو دفرين لم داوي روابو هر كاتك دروي كذا شتيك دي كروي دا يان باران داري يان جفت كان دكوتا يان باو دكان بقول بسرسر ما داري من لكوش تيجي جولة داري تيجي زوري بهم بوي نامو دي بيان خنا من بيان قلت لم قرب روما داري بكي ستابعي دنيا نخوشية مزفري سوحتا ليلة دعلم دنيا جوان دا دانشا أما أو كوشكية كمان بوخوم مدروس كرد بوخوم فريشتا كان بوخوم شيطانا كان ليلة دا دانشا وآرام كرد فريشتا كان ميش بوتو شيطانا كان ميش بوتو درو تعاونو دبيتو بدور بي دور تيدقي تو دبيت تعاونا كان بدور بي. Now I'll read from the opening page of the book and a little bit from the end of the same chapter just to give you a flavor of 2 different types of writing in this work. From early that first morning, I knew he was keeping me locked in. He told me that a fatal disease, a plague of some sort, had spread outside. Whenever he told lies, the birds would fly away. It had been that way since he was a child. Whenever he told a lie, something strange would happen. Either a sudden downpour would begin, trees would fall down, or a flock of birds would soar above our heads. I was being held prisoner inside a large green mansion within a sequestered forest. He brought me a stack of books and told me to read them. Let me out, was all I said in response. There is disease and corruption everywhere, Muzaffar Ismail, he said. Stay here in this beautiful world. This is the mansion I built for myself and my angels, for myself and my devils. Stay here and be patient. What's mine is yours. There is a disease out there, and You understand? And now a little bit from the end of the first chapter. I felt that the outside world had its own kind of perfections too. I hadn't occupied an important place in the world. Life was going on perfectly well without me. Things had their own lives and meanings. I didn't feel my absence had left a hole in anyone's life. After 21 years, I was sure Sayyasis Ra'dam was living his own life as well. I was sure Sayyasis Ra'dam too, just like all the others, felt I was dead. Until the 10th year of my imprisonment, I had only one hope, to see Sayyasis Ra'dam for a few minutes and then die. But then, one morning, I woke up and abandoned that hope too. After 10 years of separation, every reunion is another loss. Sayyas and I had become an imaginary father and son. One morning when I was looking at the sand, when I was looking at the aging of the desert, it dawned on me that I would never become a father. I knew I would return like a block of sand, like someone who would turn anything he touches into dust. Fatherhood is an embrace, but I was a fistful of black earth. On my return, I would only ever see life through images of the desert. The night I was released, I didn't know where Sayyasis Ra'dam was. I didn't know we would both eventually get lost in the desert that was neither mine nor his. Thank you.
So, thank you for that, and thank you for, it really is just a brilliant book. It's a joy, it's an absolute joy to read. And is both transporting and grounding, it's a magical combination of that. We wondered if you could speak to a little bit about the process that led you to here, to us, to this book, because it has been a rather long and winding road, and not one that both, I think, makes sense of your biography, but also took you unexpected places. So if you could, there's a lot of people in the room who are interested in that path and in the path of translation itself, and so if you want to place that for us a bit, and then we'll ask some questions and open up the floor.
Sure. So, I studied English language and literature for my BA degree in Kurdistan in the 1990s. And then I started working as a translator, translating into Kurdish mostly. And increasingly, my jobs had an element of journalism and translation. And then I did a master's in journalism in London, and I started working for the BBC, where translation was part of my job. But what I was doing was political journalism, like purely hard news, if you like. Then in 2008, this book came out. In Kurdish, it's called Ghazalus u Bakhtani Khayal, Ghazalus and the Gardens of Imagination by Bakhtiar. It was an amazing novel, but something else happened that was also very interesting from a journalistic perspective. For the first time in the Kurdish region, and probably in the wider region, with the exception maybe of Turkey, probably Israel, Bakhtiar got a very good advance for the publishing of this book. I think something like $25,000 or $10,000. Or either he got $10,000 and 25,000 copies were printed, or the other way around. Yeah. So this was quite huge by the local standards. As you might know, in the region, even in countries like Iran, Egypt, with huge populations, most novels are printed in small numbers, and a lot of writers don't get paid. So for Sorani speakers, who number in Iraq only about 5 million, this is equivalent to a book printing 150,000 copies in the UK, multiply that by 5 for the US market. So it's huge. So I contacted the BBC News website. I said, I think I am detecting a publishing phenomenon, and I'd like to do a report on this. We are always talking about war and violence and Iraq and all this. This is something different. And they said, why not? So I read the book for a second time, interviewed Bakhtiar, and so I wrote a piece for the BBC website. Of course, I had read Barkar all my life until then because he's a big name in Kurdistan, so I wasn't new to his work. Then I thought, I've done a lot of homework, I need to do a bit more with what I've done. So I decided maybe I should review the book in English. And then I did some research. I'd never reviewed the book before. There's a magazine in London that's very prestigious, the Times Literary Supplement. They have a section for books that haven't yet appeared in English, so you can review those books. So I contacted them. I thought they'll probably say no, but I'll try. And they said, no, why don't you write and we'll take it from there. So I wrote a review, sent it to them, they published it. It was actually on the cover edition that week. And then the BBC Radio saw the review, contacted me, they did a program, and this is where my involvement really ends. Then a literary agent from New York had seen those things, got in touch with me through the magazine. He said, I'm really interested in this book. So do you know any literary professional Kurdish translators? I said, well, the fact that no Kurdish novels have been translated into English probably tells you there are no professional literary Kurdish translators. But I've studied English, I'm writing in English for the BBC, I've done translation of other types. I'm very happy to give a go, and I won't be offended if you don't like my copy. He said, no, that's a very good start. And he said, okay, I need 15,000 words, the opening 45 pages of the book, then a chapter by chapter synopsis of the book, your biography, Bakhtiar's biography. And here's the catch. There is no guarantee I can find your publisher. If I fail to find your publisher, you don't get paid for this. This is not just unique to you, this is how it works for translated fiction, with the exception of the established writers in the world. I said, okay, challenge taken. So I'm working full-time for the BBC. I have a 3-hour commute at the time, every day, and I was doing this on the side. Luckily, I had a few editor friends at the BBC. Some of them were very literary people. One of them, Melanie Moore, translates from French, English, and Greek, from French, Russian, and Greek into English. And a couple of other people. I said, I'm doing this thing, I'm doing a sample. I would love you if you guys have a look at it and send me your feedback. And they did, and I shared this with the publisher. And this is post-2008, financial crisis has just started. The agent said, I'm really sorry, I don't think I can find a publisher for this. If this was 3 years ago, I would take a risk on it because we have a lot of resources, we had a lot of funding. But now, the world has changed. But I know there's a publisher for this somewhere. So, but I'm not the one who can find it, but I'm sure you can find the publisher if you want. So I know nothing about the publishing world at this point, and I felt, well, I've done even more now, I can't stop here. So he gave me a couple of tips and went away. So I started my own research, I started from all the big houses and sent email here and there. Initially I would send a publisher an email and sit on it for 2 months, and then someone said, no, you just have to try everyone at the same time. Because you never know if they'll get back to you or not get back to you. So in short, around 20 rejection letters and a year later, I found the publisher. And with very basic terms, we published the book. So it took a couple of years, and this is the result. And it went out. This one, I'll just tell you a little bit about this one as well. This one is even more stories inside stories. So this one is a story of a group of friends led by a poet. His name is Ghazalnous. It means he who writes ghazals. The group includes a former assassin who has now become very pacifist, a Hollywood film buff, a woman who weaves beautiful carpets. They have this obsession that they want to record all the mysterious deaths in a Kurdish city. They know that a lot of deaths are happening, but no one has any record of these people and how they died. So they think there might be something political here, or it might be for other reasons. So they want to record the lives of these people, to basically to pay respect to them. The authorities get wind of this. they don't like this because some of these deaths are related to whoever is in power, they might be behind it. And then the books become this conflict between, if you like, the intellectuals and power. The authorities try to do absolutely everything they can to discourage this group, to buy them off, to every way, carrot and stick, like try everything to stop them, but they are quite adamant they want to do this. But then there are dozens of subplots under this, and a lot of like magical realism in quite a heavy way. You have a woman who's, for example, weaving beautiful carpets, and the carpets can fly. You have this character who's a Hollywood film buff. He takes blind children on imaginary journeys, on the oceans, on seas, and he describes these journeys, which are only in their imaginations. So yeah, this is the story of this book, and I thought, I am not going to do this again. Once is enough. Especially the part to do with the process of finding a publisher, because it was quite difficult to get all these rejection letters, all these silences, all these false hopes, because in the first couple of months, a couple of publishers said, wow, this is fascinating, just give us a couple of weeks. And some of them came back to me like 18 months later, and still a no, or still saying, we haven't forgotten about you, given us more time. And to one of them, I had the joy of saying, no, I found the publisher. So yeah, I thought this process is just, it's heartbreaking. I don't know if I can go through this again. And then out of nowhere, Archipelago Books, a very prestigious publishing house in New York. It's a small house, but they do really good work, and they publish beautiful books. Most of their books are translations from other languages. The publisher got in touch with me, Jill Schoolman. She said, we have read your translation, we really liked it, and we want you to translate another novel for us by Bakhtiar that we have some knowledge of from the German edition, because they have an editor who speaks German, and they have people in the German market. And the last Pomegranate Tree had done really well in German. I think by now it has been printed 4 or 5 times, 25,000 copies have been printed. All the major German language publications, the equivalent of your New York Times, New York, have written about it. And Bakhtiar has been on all sorts of TV, radio shows to discuss it. And that actually landed him a publisher that said, you are my writer now, I'm going to publish absolutely everything you have written in German. And so far they have published 6 of his books, 5 novels, 1 non-fiction, and they're going to publish more of his work. So now the process of translation itself, a little bit on that, because I'm telling this story in this detailed way to just tell you some of the challenges that we face as translators, but also as translators from Kurdish. So obviously, even though Sorani is much more established than Kirmanji, because we have been writing in Sorani and schooling in Sorani for at least 100 years now, writing for it for longer, but we have had schooling since the early 20th century. Believe it or not, there are still no half-authoritative Kurdish English dictionaries. So that's the first thing you really need as a translator, an authoritative dictionary that can tell you a word, whether it's a flower, whether it's the name of a type of dress, or whatever it is. So that's the first obstacle. And second thing is that you don't have a legion of top translators. When you are stuck, you can turn to them and say, you know, I have this expression, or I have this problem. What would you do? Both to help you with the translation of the text, but also to tell you, you know what, I know a publisher, I'll put you in touch with them. Or I know an editor who can help in this situation. So that means that it can be, in one sense, it can be quite a lonely job. And then there are no institutions that can help you say, no, you want to do this project, I'll provide a grant for the translation. I'll help out the publisher, because most publishing houses are indie houses, don't have a lot of money. If they know there's an institution that can provide support financial support, and they are more likely to take on a project. And then beyond that, for most other languages, definitely our neighbors, Turkish, Farsi, Arabic, let alone European languages, they have been studied in the West for hundreds, some of them for hundreds of years. There are universities that were studying Arabic or Turkish maybe even 200 years ago. So you have already a very rich infrastructure, whether it's a university, whether it's a cultural institution. You have a very well-educated diaspora community. So all these can be very, very helpful in spreading the word, but also in helping you as a translator when you come into the process. And also some of them, they can play the role that you need when you want to publish a book. But when these institutions are there, not there, which there aren't for Kurdish, it means a lot of onus is on your shoulder as a translator. So that makes the process slightly harder. But you need to become more creative. So one of the things I decided to do from the beginning was that I struck this collaboration with Melanie. She needs to be really acknowledged here because she was working with me on the translation, or rather the editing of both novels. But in the process, I'm the only one who speaks both languages, whether when I'm in contact with the publishing house or with Melanie. So I sort of have the final say on is this the right way of doing this sentence, this word, or not. So I often say, although all these people helped hugely, I am the one who is responsible for the overall work. And if there are any mistakes or flaws, my hands up, I'm responsible for it. So that's one level. The other level is that because you don't have a lot of resources, sometimes I'll be stuck for a word, for an expression. I have Arabic, I have a little bit of Farsi just because if you speak Arabic and if you speak Sorani, by definition you know some Farsi. So sometimes I'll go and see, okay, let me check some Kurdish Farsi dictionaries, Kurdish Arabic dictionaries, Kurdish Turkish dictionaries, or talk to someone who speaks these other languages. So if they do, then you have more dictionaries from Turkish, from Arabic, from Farsi into English, and it might get you somewhere. Failing that, at the time when I was translating this one, my daughter, my stepdaughter, she grew up in England, English is first language. I would call her over and say, look, there's this tree, it has these things, or there's this dress, it has this, and I'd say, oh yeah, this is called this. And then we'll Google image it, and then, yeah, actually it is that. Or I'll just write a long email to Melanie and say, oh, we have this kind of rock in a mountain. It says it is this big, it's this way, whatever. But rock is not it. And then she would come up with a few words in English, and then we will look at Google images. Yeah, I think it's this one. Or a kind of boat, or whatever it might be. So you'll have to go really the long way sometime to get there. So on the one hand, of course, you have heard this expression that being a writer is a lonely job. Sometimes I joke and say being a Kurdish translator can be that any day because of all the things that I mentioned. But at the same time, it's not true because you are forced to really seek other people's support. You have to reach out to other people. So you can't stay in your silo and just say, you know what, I'm just behind the computer. So you'll have to ask other people whether they have Kurdish or not. And sometimes it's the same word in Turkish, or it's the same word in Arabic or Farsi. That can also help as well. But the point is that it makes the process more difficult. And then finally post the publication of the book. Again, with other languages, for example, I've been to events where I've met translators from Swedish, from Estonian, other languages. These are, for example, languages with a very small population. However, they still have universities that study their literature, have done a lot of work on their literature. There are translation grants, there are grants to promote the book. In fact, one of the major responsibilities of consulates of these countries and their embassies is to promote their culture. So they have staff to help you with that. They may have even grants for these things beyond the academia and the cultural world, which are very, very helpful because they have done it. They know how to get there fast. But if you haven't done it, you don't even know how to build these connections, these networks. So you're starting from zero. And it's one thing if Karim is reaching out to institution, it's another if the Estonian Cultural Center is reaching out to people. So all these really play a very big part in the process, and whether you like it or not, you'll become an ambassador for the book. And you might be someone who's shy, who doesn't like be facing public and all that, but if you want the book to do well, and if you want more Kurdish books to be published in English, this is also an important part of the process. So that's one of the reasons I'm doing it, and I'm very grateful you're all here. I can talk much more, but I'd like to maybe move to another question.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. This is really, I think, to see how much was involved in even getting the first book out there, and then it doesn't end, because you are still, right now, allegedly the only one. So, paraphrasing you, you had to become your own institution, so to speak, to get this from the first idea and the wish to do it, to having a publishing house publish it, and to having the possibility to have this on a book table there, you know, in the bookstore, to order it somewhere. And so you talked a little bit about all the decisions that you had to make, more or less on your own, though dependent on other people, which brings me to a question related very closely to the sort of handiwork of translation. Because if you read the book, you'll see there are at least three different strategies in translating culturally, maybe not really known concepts or events or historical happenings. And you have a few footnotes, not that many, but you have a few explaining things, and then it also states very clearly these are translator's notes. Then you have expressions or mostly given names that are translated in text. So Mohammed Dil-Shushe would be translated in the book as Mohammed the Glass-Hearted, and so you would know, because it's important to the plot of the story, that this is his name. And you have the original epic translation, but others you've chosen to not translate at all. So there is Bulbul, and either you know what that means or you don't. And then if you don't, maybe you have the option of looking it up. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how what went into making these decisions, and what you think in general about translatability.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. First of all, there isn't one strategy that is correct and that is it. It's really a matter of personal opinion, personal preferences, and for me, it has really been work in progress. And this is one of the things that I had to sort of ingrain in myself, that there isn't just one way of doing things. Initially, I was hoping that I will not do any translation into English until maybe I retire or something. Then my English will be so amazing, it will become perfect, if you like. But then over time, I realized that the paradox is, if you don't do translation into English, if you don't work with literature, you will not have this perfect English or improved English. So it's a craft. Part of it is a craft. So the more you do it, hopefully the better you get at it. But also there's an element of interpretation. Whether we like it or not, if everyone in the room spoke both languages, and if we all translated this book, we'll have as many copies of the book as there are people here. Because every sentence can be translated in more than one way. And initially, even though I had worked in translation for a long time, I actually struggled with this. I was thinking, no, but there must be a good way. But there isn't really a good way. Of course, you can't translate a tree and say this means wall. Like, I'm not talking about basics, but I'm talking beyond that. Once you have certain fluency, then there are so many different strategies. So what I've done personally, let's start from the footnotes. For the first book, I thought I'm going to have 150 footnotes in this book. Like, I want to just write so many footnotes because there's so much history, there's so much culture, I don't want people to miss out on this. And then the publisher said, no, there is no way we're going to have many. At most maybe 10, at most maybe 20, because it's a big book. But the Anglophone world, when it comes to fiction, we don't like footnotes. Sorry, you have just to accept that. Of course, there are exceptions if you are James Joyce and you have written Ulysses and you become very famous, or I don't know, if you are Nabokov and you have one of his books and it's the Oxford University Press, it's a different matter. But generally speaking, a paperback doesn't have a lot of footnotes. So that option was taken out quickly. But also over time I realized that there are certain references that people can Google and they can learn that way as well. They don't need to be fed everything. And then also, where do you really draw the line? Maybe there are things, I think it refers to something the writer didn't even mean that, or the other way around. And who is the judge here? Just because the writer says, I meant it, do we trust that? Or because I say this is really a reference to this event, do you take my word for it? You know, like all these things, discussions in post-structuralism, in literary criticism, that there isn't one way, there isn't one version that is true of everything. So that comes into the discussion. So that is the footnote. The other thing is that I personally had read Salman Rushdie's novels, and I had noticed that one of the things he had done, of course he writes in English, but every now and then he is using a word that's either Arabic or Indian or that's not English. He writes it in the original language, and in text he'll explain it. It might be, for example, in Kurdish we have a word shila, which means 40 or 40 days. The 40 days that you mourn for someone's death. I came across exactly this in one of his novels. Or you have a character called Layl or Layla, he'll say this means night. And I thought this is really a nice way because it doesn't take away the reader, they don't have to go to the back of the book, even to a footnote. In text it tells them. And the Kurdish reader, they immediately know this because they know Kurdish. So it's only fair if the English reader can have access to this information. But of course you can't overdo it because then it will become like too cumbersome and it might become too complex a process. There are also other places where, for example, in both books we had situations where it would refer to an incident, for example, the uprising. In Bashur, in Iraqi Kurdistan, if you say after the uprising, everyone immediately knows you are referring to the uprising of 1991. The same way, like for example, if someone says after the Second World War, we all know we are talking about 1945. So I thought it's not fair for English readers, who probably English language readers, who may not necessarily know a lot about Kurdish history, not to know when this happened. So at the first mention, when I say after the uprising, I might add 1991, even though the original text doesn't have there. So we have made minor changes like this to signpost the reader. And this partly comes from my journalism. As a journalist, you want to simplify the world for your readers. You want your readers not to get lost. You want them to know where they are. For the names, one of the things that Bakhtiar does in a lot of his novels, he gives his characters significant names. It's often names he has coined for that character. And my decision was, how important is this character? How important is the significance of the name? If I thought it was significant enough for the plot, I would translate it in text as well. But I would still provide the Kurdish because it gives you a flavor. But if it was a minor character, or if the significance was not very obvious, then I would say it's okay. For example, the word bulbul. In some English dictionaries, it's still bulbul is mentioned as it's a type of bird. So if you go to an Oxford dictionary, the long version, it will still give you that, even though originally it's not an English word. But also it's not a character that's as significant as the others. So these are really some of the strategies I use. And there are we have this basically range when it comes to translation. At one end, you have people who want to anglify everything. So they want the names even to be changed, they want the currency to be changed. If you let them, they'll change the name of towns as well.
It takes place in Texas.
Yeah, no, seriously, like you have people who want to say that, you know, like they say this happened in a motel. Say, but we don't have motels in the Middle East, let's say. They say, no, but That's what the US reader understands. And at the other end, you have people who want to say, no, everything has to retain its local color, local flavor, and we can't really help the reader at all. It's their problem they don't understand. And I personally am somewhere in between. That's my approach. And as I say, there is no right and wrong, but it's good to know there's a range of approaches here. And this is also a conversation. For example, in the first novel that I was translating, there's an expression in Kurdish. If you're talking about someone who is dead, and you're talking about them in a warm way, after you mention their name, you say Gori Parlanurbe. It means may their grave be filled with light. It means because it's a dark place, you want it to be filled with light. It means you are sending them some good vibes. And initially I thought maybe this is crazy, like it mentions someone, but it's an important detail that they're mentioning someone, they say this, it means they like this character. And initially I was thinking, maybe is there an equivalent in English? Any type of English, British, American, it doesn't matter. And then I just put made their grave be filled with light and sent it to Melanie, and it came back, she said, wow, that's so poetic, and it immediately got it. You don't need any explanation, it doesn't matter, I haven't ever read this, it still makes sense. So for example, that one, I said, okay, we don't need to change that. But sometimes maybe you come across a proverb that's so local, if you don't know the history of that part of the world, it will just be lost in translation. Then in that case, you might think of something that's more understandable for an English reader. So, yeah.
Can I pick up on that to talk about the word that's both sort of overdetermined, like we did, which is politics and art. And we've talked about this, and I'd love to have you reflect a bit, both on the question of whether, to what extent it's possible to take the novel on its own terms. What does that mean? What does it mean to talk about it? How often does it get reduced to or drawn into sort of politicized conversations? But also, if you could, tell us a little bit about, in the content of the novel itself. So Bakhtiar wrote it for Kurds. He wrote it for Sorani speakers.
Yeah.
And he wrote it as part of an effort within a community, to an audience, to sort of parse the political world, the scars, the traumas, the loves, the fragility of the world that they had just been navigating, without thinking that this would be translated into any other language where it would be read and uptaken in different ways. So if you could give us a little sense of like how politics works within the novel, in its own reference to its own audiences, and then how, as you have worked to translate and to move with the book and to market the book and to see it be read in English-speaking context, that has framed its reception and its circulation.
That's an excellent question. So just to give you some context about the wider literature scene, the Kurdish literature historically has been dominated by poetry. So until 30, 40 years ago, probably 90% of most writing in Kurdish in literary forms were in poetry. Obviously, this is not very unusual. A lot of our neighbors also, poetry is more dominant than prose. It was until a certain point in our recent history. So novel writing is something new for us, fiction writing. Of course, we have people who have wrote short stories in the 1920s, and you have novels in the 50s. But novels as an art form that's complex, that has complex characters, that has complex themes, that has different genres, that you have language that takes the story to a different level. We've only really come to this in the past maybe 30 years or so. Before that, it was much more simple, if you like. And that's really in line with the development of the art of fiction with other nations as well. The first few novels are normally, the early generation, are quite basic, and then it becomes much more complex as an art. So it's good to take that into consideration when you are reading this novel. This is one thing. The second thing is that until recently, maybe 30, 40 years ago again, a lot of Kurdish writing was about, the lens was toward the outside world. It was about how the Kurds are victims, they have been brutally suppressed, and why the suppressors and oppressors are doing this. So a lot of it was an act of activism, if you like, in our poetry, in our journalism as well. But in the past 30, 40 years, a lot of Kurdish writers, including Bakhtiar, they've moved to training their lens on the Kurdish society itself as well. Away from, okay, what the external forces are doing to it, but internally, as a society, how do we live? How do we govern? How is our politics? How is our politics shaping the conversation? What is the Kurds' own role in the way they look at the world, in the way they shape the world? A lot of Bakhtiar's work has one foot in modern Kurdish history and politics, but one foot very firmly in very universal ideas, as I said earlier. So themes to do with revolution, with love, with solidarity, with friendship, with fatherhood are very dominant in his work. And also the techniques he uses, flashback, multi-narration. For example, the first novel that I translated, it's a multi-narrator system where every chapter is narrated by a different character, all the way to the end. So you have 4 or 5 different narrators telling one story. So you are seeing the same story unfold from different perspectives. And then you have jumps from 1970 to 2002 and back to even before that. So you can see you are dealing with a writer here who knows the technique of fiction writing, who is doing a lot of characterization, who is using narration as a system that's complex. So of course we mentioned all these things about the Kurds and their history and politics, and because of that, and because of the lack of books about the Kurds in English, including Kurdish fiction, of course there will be some political reading to these books. And by definition, these books will in some way be political. I mean, I personally think being a Kurd is political. It doesn't matter, even if you are a monk, it doesn't matter. Being a Kurd will make you political for all the reasons that I mentioned. But at the same time, if we only see these novels through the prism of politics, we are really doing them injustice. Because we are not asking the same question that we ask an American or French or Russian or Chinese novel. Is the technique good? Are the characters real? Do they move us? Can we relate to them, regardless of whether we know the history or not? So my hope and ambition is that we'll have scholarly work, maybe from people in this room in the future, that will shed light on this side as well as the political side. It's a little bit like being an immigrant, and quite a few of us are immigrants in one form or another, or know people who are immigrants. When you come across people, you don't want them just to talk to you like, oh, I know another Kurd, or I know Kurdish people like this food, or Kurdish people like this kind of dancing. You want them to talk to you as a human being, like you have aspirations, you like wine, you go and do yoga, you love football. It just, you do all the other, you do love, you fail at it, you succeed, you know? And for the book, to me, it's the same thing. I don't want it to be seen, of course you can't help, but this is my ambition. I hope it will be seen in a multitude of ways. Not just, this is a Kurdish novel by an immigrant writer, it's about a particular point in time. Because I think it's about all these things together.
Thank you. I mean, that's beautiful. There are so many more questions. I'm just listening to you. I think we should open up the discussion in a second. Just listening to you, I thinking that the book itself, I think it makes this connection between form, or between the narrative structure and the content. Because the point of narration, without spoiling too much for you, because hopefully you'll all buy and read the book, it's even like it's removed from the plane of the story. It's an oral storytelling setting of a narrator on a ferry boat circling around lost in the Mediterranean, and it turns out to be a refugee boat. And he is constantly talking to his audience, saying, "Don't forget," like a direct address also to the listener, or well, to the reader in our case. Don't forget, and then continuing the story. And in translating this book into English, I feel you've enlarged the audience who
Summoned
is
us to that audience. Yeah.
summoned to in the narrative structure that this is sort of weaved into, but we take all the political content with that. So to
Absolutely.
speak, yeah.
No, I mean, that relates also to your question. Of course, this was written in 2002. At that point, none of Bakhtiar's work has been translated into English or any other language for that matter. And he says, I didn't have any idea what will happen to my books, whether they will live on, whether, and at that point, he's not a full-time writer. He has to do small jobs alongside his writing to make a living in Germany. So he wasn't thinking one day millions of people potentially might be reading my book. So it is written for a different audience, of course. So that's important to bear that in mind. And then when you take that to the international stage, if you like, of course, it will widen the audience, it will widen the ways this book might be read. Because whether we like it or not, when we are reading a book, especially a book of fiction, we bring our own experiences into that book. So where I grew up, what books I have read before this one, what I know about this part of the world, will have a direct impact on how I understand this book. I mean, I personally, for example, as a teenager, I've read a lot of Latin American literature, Gabriel Garcia Marquez and others, and only later in life I realized, wow, some of this is so political about the history of Colombia, about slavery, about a lot of oral traditions, but at the time, to me, it was non-existent, this angle. It doesn't matter, like, there is no right and wrong, and I still enjoyed it, and I still want me to read more. But readers will bring their own experiences. But luckily for us, I think this book has a lot of scope for everyone, even if you don't know a lot about the Kurdish history or even the history of the wider region.
Turn to let others speak as well. Yes, I'll field questions. Flag me down. Yes, you.
Well, first, I'd like to give you a point of encouragement on publication. I know Scott Fitzgerald, very famous American writer, got his stories rejected more than 30 times before he got the first one published. So keep going.
Thank you.
And the second is, I want to know the place of women in your culture. Is it a matriarchal, patriarchal? Are they put in a higher esteem than some of the women in that region seen? I've heard of the warrior spirit of the court, of course.
Yeah.
And also, are they famous authors that are women? And in your stories, where do they fit?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think there isn't one answer to that question in the sense that it depends like anywhere else. It depends, there isn't one Kurdish society that's unified, that has one unified approach and stance towards women. So in my hometown in Suleymaniya, there might be one way of, for one place for women, but if you go to a village in a remote mountains, there might be a different way. Even in my hometown, it depends. Are you middle class? Are you educated? And all these things. But broadly speaking, and I'm really generalizing here, I think that generally speaking, I think it's quite a moderate approach. Like, we are somewhere in the middle of where the wider middle is. So we are not very, how to put it, like, women are not brutally oppressed, but they are not as free as they can be. So they are probably somewhere in the middle, but they can study, there is no, veil is not imposed, and depending on where you are, they might have more freedom. Obviously they are working, they are out there in universities, and there are definitely Kurdish women writers. There are some who already write in English. For example, Shoman Hardi is a name that comes to mind. She has written poetry, and she published her debut novel in English only, was it last year or beginning of this year? So yeah, there's a variety of approaches, and there are women writers and activists, but it really depends where you are. And the good thing is that I think partly because of the Kurdish struggle for nationhood or for liberation, if you like, the religious conservative forces have remained minor in that struggle. So the Kurds have never had a problem with religion in the sense that they could always be Muslim if they wanted to. So they were not suppressed on that ground. What they were suppressed for was their ethnic identity. So the bigger thing when you talk to Kurds and Kurdish political parties in the wider movement, it's more to do with nationalism and language and cultural rights. And that, by definition, means in that space women can prosper more because the conservative forces are not the leading forces of Kurdish society and politics. Of course, we have Islamic parties and Islamic forces, but for now they remain a small part of the wider political spectrum. And probably it's because of this conflict that I just mentioned. So yeah, I mean, I hope that does justice to your question.
The role of the sisters in the book is a very, there are a pair of sisters in this book who have a really nuanced and complicated and interesting path through the story, the role they play in the story, their commitment to each other. There's a lot of nothing is black and white. The book slips and slides. The glass is really part of it. There's a lot of shimmering and gleaming and moving and just kind of not being able to pin anything down to just one. You think you know where something is going, and the sentence shifts a bit, and it's part of the texture of the writing and part of, I think, the beauty of the story as well.
Yeah, I got curious because when you started reading the book, I didn't hear you wanted to find your lost son. But there was no mention, maybe I missed it, but there was no mention of who mothered his son.
Have to read the book to find out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean.
So I'm like, where is the mother?
Exactly.
Miriam, oh yeah, sorry, Miriam, Origi,
And then H.
sorry, yeah. I don't know who was first.
Who wants to go first?
I didn't see.
What's happening?
Okay, thank you, Jay. And thank you so much. This is great, and thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to listen the novel in its original language, Kurdish. So it is amazing to hear that the New Yorker publisher is already familiar with Bakhtiyar's book. Am I pronouncing correctly?
Yes.
Bakhtiyar's novels from the German translations, which augments their interest in the book or in the translation of the books into English. And also you mentioned about your engagement, consultation with various languages,
Yeah.
your collaboration with other language speakers. So I see a lot of interlinguistic, translinguistic relationships here.
Yeah.
So saying all that, I am wondering if you had the chance to interact with translators of Bakhtiyar's novels into other languages such as German, Farsi, Turkish, not in terms of translating them into English, but in terms of the translation process. What kind of challenges, struggles they experienced, or some, you mentioned some techniques,
Yeah.
wise. So yeah, I would like to hear more about that.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I happen to know the German translator. Interestingly, his name is Rawesh. He's a Kurd from Bashur, from Iraq, who lives in Austria. So he said, like, he was talking to his friends often about Kurdish culture and literature. People say, okay, so who are your writers? And you say, oh, we have Sherko Bekir, we have Bakhtiyar, and this and that. And say, can we read their work in German? Oh no, it's not available. And it's like a dead end. And he said, when I first started translating Bakhtiyar's work, I thought if I just managed to give it to my friends, that would be enough. Just to show them, look, we have also something. This gives you a glimpse of the kind of thing we are exposed to. And not very, unlike me as well, because he didn't grow up in Austria, he also decided to do it in a collaborative way. He also is working with a German native speaker, so it's a duo who are translating the book into German. I can imagine that their process in some ways might be more complicated because if resources are far and few between Kurdish and English, between Kurdish and German, it's probably worse. So that makes it harder. That's one thing. The other thing is, on the other hand, it might be easier or it might not be. The fact that Bakhtiar is a fluent German speaker. So both in terms of consulting with him, but both in terms of him coming and saying, I don't like this one. Because he reads all the translations before they are out in the German one. In the English one, his English is very good for understanding. If he was here today, he will understand absolutely everything we are talking about. He could even read in English, but he can't speak in English, and it's not at a level where he can make nuanced decisions. So I couldn't go to him and say, will you use this English word, so this word, so this word or that word. So that's one of the differences that we think of. The Farsi translated is very interesting. He's again a Kurdish guy from Iraq, from the Halabja area. His family went into Iran after the chemical attack in 1988, and he spent a lot of time there, so he picked up Farsi and he went to school there. And he is the main translator into Farsi, and in Farsi it has done probably better than any other language's books, particularly this one. I think it has been, the second one, the last pomegranate tree. I think it has been reprinted more than 10 times. And there has been a lot of good writing on it. But it's also interesting from a sociological angle that all the translators so far are themselves Kurds who have immigrated to another country. Like if you look at Turkish, Arabic, these other literatures, we are starting to see people who are, it might be someone who grew up in London, it might be a John or an Elizabeth, you know, but in Kurdish we don't have that. And it's partly because of what I mentioned earlier, because you don't have Kurdish courses at universities, we don't have the institutions that offer that. So there are these similarities. And one final thing is that in terms of the difference, the Anglophone world has the most, by far, the most rigorous editing process, regardless of whether this is a translated book or a book written in English. So English by nature is not very open to a lot of changes, you know. It's a little bit strict, if you like. German, French, these other languages, they are more open, they are more liberal, if you like. But also the editing process is much more, it's looser. So this is one of the things in my conversation with them and Bakhtiar that they've realized that the editing that you go through the English, you get far more comments and queries and suggestions. And it's not because how my English is. Like for every English book, even if it's written by an English-speaking person, or you get more comments. So there is more rigor in the process. From what I am hearing and from what Bakhtiar is telling me, this doesn't mean they don't get edited. I'm just saying for every book it's different, and that obviously reflects on you and your work as a translator.
AJ, and then if we have time. I'm sorry, let's go first. I'm sorry. I didn't know.
Thank you very much. This was really fascinating. I have two questions. One, you mentioned the diasporic context already, but it seems that the diasporic context is also influential for Bakhtiar himself, who is in his German networks. So what does it mean in terms of like reconstructing Kurdistan when you're in German, when you're in a German context? Does it evoke nostalgia? Other ideas, especially since I guess until before 2004 they were cut off of many networks and writers. And the second question is that you touched upon, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it. Is like how you convey in English a multilingual context where you have, as you've mentioned, Arabic and Turkish. And I imagine that Sorani itself has like different registers based on education or time, people more Arabized or less Arabized.
Yeah.
And then you're like with the English, so how do you convey these tensions?
Thank you. That's a good question. Two good questions. The first one, in terms of Bakhtiar's writing, and I feel I can speak on Bakhtiar's behalf because we have done 7, 8 events just in the past 3 weeks where I was interpreting for them. So some of these questions came up elsewhere as well. In his writing, I don't yet sense a lot of strong feeling of nostalgia, that kind of thing, partly because he is still in touch with Kurdistan. He visits every year, sometimes twice a year. So it's not, as he was telling me one day, he said, you know, when the daily Kurdish newspaper, Hawati or Kurdistania comes out, I can read it online before someone in Suleimania sometimes. So this is not the world of 70s and 80s where immigrants didn't have a pomegranate for ages or didn't get a letter or couldn't hear a voice. You are in touch constantly, as we all know now. We live in this globalized world. We hear people all the time. So because of that, you don't feel there's a huge disconnect. In terms of the diaspora and the role, it's of course very, very important because they can play the part of the missing link, which is the Kurdish institutions. So if they recommend the book to their friends, to their book clubs, to their universities, to their libraries, it plays a huge role in promoting the book. Whether they are doing that enough, we still don't know. Bakhtiar says for a lot of my events in Germany, sometimes there isn't even a single Kurd. And he has done 130 events between 2017 and now. And this is not a complaint, it's just an observation. Partly because people are economic migrants, partly because of other reasons they might not be attending. I don't know exactly why. But also partly because a lot of Kurdish readers, they already know Bakhtiar through his Kurdish, the original Kurdish. So they might not be as interested in the German or English edition. I don't know. But I think they have a very important part to play because we don't have proper institutions. But they are here, they know, they have a network of people they know, they might know some institutions. And some of these have been important, like Haveen is here, like she's studying Kurdish, she has a Kurdish heritage. Maybe that's important for that conversation, you know. But similarly, like Kelda is anthropologist, she speaks Kirmanji, she can play that part, she can play a role in that discussion in a different way. For the register of Kurdish, one thing is actually Kurdish, because we've had schooling in Sorani since the 1920s. There was this process by the early writers between 1920 and 1960s. They've started to, what they call purify the Kurdish language from Arabic terms. So in writing, we have very, very few words that are Arabic now. In our conversation, depending on your education and background, you may come across a lot of Arabic words or Farsi words, but in writing, especially on the Iraqi side, like if you read a page from Bakhtiar's book, it will have very few words that are Arabic, just because of that process. That's one thing. The other thing is that when you have different registers, you try to come up with strategies. For example, in the first novel that I translated, we have a character who's a mullah. He writes very long letters. He's sending it to his son, or left the letters to his son. And his way of speaking is like someone who is from the 19th century. It's full of Arabic words. It's full of religious terms and connotations. So in the translation, we tried to convey that through some of the, like we've used some words that are made, for example, used in the Bible or in religious texts in English. So I hope like when you read it, you feel, okay, this register is different from this one. And also sometimes the language is very conversational because two people are talking. Sometimes it's formal because it's someone writing a letter. In one of the books, we have a character who's a politician, and he's writing a diary. And his diary become one of the things that make it into the book. And obviously, a diary is more formal than if he was talking, and he's an educated man. So his register is slightly different. In The Last Pomegranate Tree, we have a character who is very, very informal, who swears a lot, he repeats certain words. We try to keep that flavor in the English. Of course, these things you don't know really whether you succeeded or not until people read it, but it's it's just being mindful of that this particular register is different from the previous chapter, and you try to work with that.
Thank you so much. This has been so informative and interesting, exhilarating, really. I have a couple questions. I guess the first one is, since Bakhtiar is with us in spirit, is maybe more for him, but you're addressing on his behalf, and I'm wondering who he's influenced by, like what authors or traditions, and also sort of tangential to that, if his work has been translated into Arabic. So that's one question. Second one is more for you, and it's about your working relationship with them. Because I'm a translator of Arabic, so I really appreciate your emphasis on the literariness of the text and the aestheticness of the text. And I'm wondering, when you're working with him, if you've ever had sort of a disagreement on a translation, and that you've decided, actually, no, I'm going to go with this, even though he said it this, or what your working relationship is like. Because I'm of the belief that a translation is both the most intimate reading of a text, but also a rewriting of the text.
Of course.
And so I'm wondering if that's ever happened. And then one last comment, just because I'm so interested, like this is what I would choose to do on Friday night every week.
Yeah, thank you.
I think the fact that there's no dictionary in Sorani is obviously so lamentable, and that needs to be changed. At the same time, I think that this collaborative, the fact that it's forced you to be so collaborative, so innovative, has perhaps made your translation like that much better. Like I haven't read it yet, so I can't judge, but I'm of the belief that the best translations are collaborative in spirit and follow this methodological approach that you have. And so sometimes when we just rely on a dictionary, we're not trying to really unearth that meaning. So rather than that being a total challenge, which obviously is a huge challenge, along with institutional challenge and politics of power, perhaps it's also something that's advantageous, that's made you
That's very true.
a better translator.
Yeah. Thank you. Really good questions. So influences on Bakhtiar. Bakhtiar is one of the most read person I've met in my life. And I don't say just that because I'm translating it. It comes across in his writing, in the books he has written, but it's also partly because of where he comes from. So he was born in the 60s, so in the 1980s, Iraq is in a war with Iran. Every young man has to be drafted into the army. And he doesn't want to take part in that war, like a lot of people in his generation. And that meant that he had to go into hiding, because he became a deserter, because he didn't want to be drafted into the army. Because if you were arrested as someone who had done this, you could be executed, or at least spend time, the rest of your life in prison. So he often says it's lamentable, but also maybe it was good for him that he spent almost a decade in hiding. In that decade, he was doing nothing but reading and writing. And he says, I was reading on average 12, 14 hours a day for 10 years. So, and this, like, when Bakhtiar first came out, it was an explosion, because the uprising happened, and we said, okay, no more hiding. So, like, he would do a seminar like this, and I was a teenager, I would listen to him and say, okay, I'll make some notes, I'll go and read these writers, and next week we'll do another seminar. He will bring sources from 100 kilometers from that one. So, but the major ones that he mentions himself, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Latin American literature in general, Italo Calvino, Salman Rushdie. In the Arab world, Muhammad Ma'hud, Mahmoud Darwish, Adonis. He speaks Arabic and Farsi, so he was reading in both languages. I believe.
He was reading these books in English, so obviously some in Farsi, some in Arabic, some had been translated into Sorani from English or Polish or okay.
Yeah,
Did he all? Yeah.
and he also picked up English in that 10 years. He started reading in English as well. So he was reading in like 4 different languages. But also another influence that's really big on him, he says, is Kurdish folklore and mythology. Because that's one thing we are very rich and because the tradition has been an oral culture for so long, we have a lot of stories and they have their own structure. And in his family, his grandmother was a storyteller from when he was a kid. He was listening to her. And he says this is probably a more influenced, one of the more marked influences than the writers he read. But as I say, he's very, very well read. And for most of his time, he hasn't had a full-time job for one reason or another. He often had either a part-time job or he was hiding or whatever. So he ended up just doing a lot of reading. So I think that...
Job is a problem. I need to quit my job.
Yeah. So that is two influences. The second question, in terms of my collaboration with him, I work with him very, very closely. So the process is, I translate a chapter, then I go through it, then inevitably I'll have some questions for him. Then I will mark all the questions, I'll send it to him, page 3, line 3, this word, or this line, or this character. Then we have a Skype talk. And then he'll come back, we will discuss. Then, once I fill in these, I'll send it to Melanie, who will come back often with questions I haven't thought of. If I can answer, I'll answer. If not, I'll have a second Skype with Baghdad. If it's a question or two, I'll keep it until the next chapter or chapters, because I don't want to be talking to him every day. So we do it every now and then, like once we have a good chunk of questions. In terms of approach, he is the easiest writer to work with because he understands that translation means rewriting his work. It is going to be different, so accept it. Like, sometimes I have to say, no, don't give me so much freedom. Like, like he says, no, like, I tell him, he tells me something, he says, this is what I meant, I said, in English we don't do that, but we do this. He says, then do this. I said, yeah, but we have sort of lost something. He said, it doesn't matter, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, what can you do? And also, every word of it is in a different language, it's in English. Of course it's going to be different. English will bring its own things to the text. I like this thing that once Salman Rushdie said. He said, a lot of people think about all the things that are lost in translation, but that there are also things that are gained in translation. And he gives the example of Khayyam. He says, the English is probably as good, maybe better than the original. Whether we agree or not, it's just one of those things. People just see one side, that we have lost the flavor. But there are times when I come across a word, like in the Kurdish it might be 3 words. Unfortunately, we don't have an example. But in English, you have just one word for that thing. And it's very, like for example, I give you an example. I unfortunately don't remember the Kurdish word, but I remember there is a point in this book, in The Last Pomegranate Tree. The character is talking about somewhere it's the woodland and there are these trees, like it's a bunch of trees together. He has to go around.
It's like cops.
It's copse. And
Yeah, I saw that. I was like, mashallah, cops.
I
How did you do that?
I didn't know the word copse. So I had used a few, like I explained it like in that part of the woodland. And then I was part of a local protest in my local area. We had this huge park in West London. There was a protest. And I was helping out the protesters. I was going to the protest camp every day. And it has different bits. Some is just a clear opening. Some of it's like a woodland. And there's this bit in the middle. And someone one day was talking to me. He said, just behind the copse. I said, what? I said, I had not heard this word. I look it up and it just means a number of trees, not too many, not too little. It's exactly that word in the book, even though the Kurdish word only describes the thing, because Kurdish doesn't have a word, copse. And I went and I changed that.
I saw
I'm
it and
so
I
happy.
wondered, what is the Kurdish word for cops and how did you, okay.
Exactly, so this is just like, and believe me, like sometimes I'm meditating and I suddenly say, oh my God, this is the thing.
Yeah.
This is the word. Sometimes I'm swimming after a long day of translation, something comes to me, if you like. And sometimes after the 10th draft, because that process that I explained, so we do that chapter by chapter until the end of the book. Then we'll go through the whole book one more time. I'll go through it. Obviously, by the end, I've changed my mind about a lot of things, because now I see the book differently. So I make a lot of changes. Then Melanie see the whole book in one go. Then she will do some changes. I agree to some of them, I disagree to others or reject the others. and then we'll go back to Bakhtiar with new questions. And then you send off to the publisher will come back with new questions, some of which I can tackle, some I can't, and some then I go back to Bakhtiar. So it is this, a lot of back and forth. One thing I always wonder is, what happens if you are translating a dead author? It's my nightmare.
You have seances with them.
Or it's another freedom, you do
Oh,
it.
yeah.
And then I have friends who translate from other languages. I have one particular friend who will remain nameless. She says, I cannot stand my writer. I absolutely love their writing, but as a human being, as someone full of herself, she has such a big ego. So she is like, her English is not good enough, but she comes and says, no, you should say this. I say, but look, you don't speak English well enough. And I haven't come to consult you about that. I've come to consult you about something else, So there is that side as well. And the last one was whether it makes it richer or not. On the record, there are dictionaries from Kurdish into English. It's just they are not very useful always. They are not authoritative. And some of them are very, very small. Like if you want anything detailed, a type of flower or bird or whatever, corpse, it will not have that. Ironically, one of the best Kurdish English dictionaries is from the 1960s. It's in Sorani. It is a joint effort between Tawfiq Wahdi and Admons. Admons was an English officer who was serving in Iraq for the Brits. He learned Sorani fluently. They write this dictionary, which is at the time was printed by the Oxford University Press. It's absolutely brilliant and very idiomatic. But the problem is the Kurdish language has changed a huge lot from the 1960s to today. And we don't have an updated version like other people who say, you know what, I'm going to take this to the next level. So a lot of the dictionaries that we have, you go for a word, I don't know, let's say perception. Let's say you are looking for the word perception in English. They will give you the definition of perception, which I already know, but I want you to give me a word for it. And they don't give you a word, like good dictionaries, they give you a couple of words.
Right.
But in Kurdish, more often than not, they just explain what it means, which is not very helpful for a translator.
Is lexicography something that you might be interested in, like dictionary work, or are you sticking with translation and journalism?
I think I'm standing by this. I think if I had more than one life, I might have entertained that idea. And at some point, I actually feel guilty that there isn't a dictionary there. And somehow the Oxford University Press were working on a Kurdish dictionary, a small one, both with Kurdish to English and English to Kurdish. And they contacted me through someone. So I said, yeah, and I worked with them on a dictionary for around a year. But we had a lot of disagreements on various things, editorial matters, so at the end I actually quit the project, but I did like 80% of the work. But this looks like a small dictionary for students, so if you are a literary translator, you need something that has the name of flowers and all these things that you don't come across every day.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And just a quick interjection. So we are very happy, and I know we haven't talked about nearly enough things that we could talk about, and so we know that our time is officially up. So I just wanted to thank all of you now, but say that we also are eager to stay here and keep talking. If you want to buy your book, because I don't know exactly when bookstore people will have to go. So if you want to buy your book and just we can keep talking, you can do that. Feel free to roam about and also maybe get some more food. And at this point also, before I forget, thank you so much, Ula Khaled, for helping us and everything, and organizing the food, and the pomegranates, which were like the best surprise of the day.
And we say too, just to link, and we'll release you, or you can stay as you wish. I'm happy to be here for into the wee hours, but that the work. So you could say this, Karima, we can say this too, that the part of the work of doing this is buying and requesting and reviewing and sharing books. Like it doesn't happen just by reading it. There's a materiality to to this world and to this infrastructure. And so just hearing you speak about the hoops that you had to go through, the way that you represent what would be like entire teams of interns and staff and so on at a Penguin, that you've had to sort of learn how to do yourself. And so on that note, yeah, teach it in your classes, review it, hand it to your friends, request it from your local library. Green has it, maybe Green needs more copies, maybe Green needs copies in multiple languages. You know, every one of us has a role to play there, for this book and for the books that we would like to see insert themselves into a canon that exists and needs to be more amplified. So
absolutely, like you can't imagine, like even a comment on Amazon or Waterstones on the other bookstores here in the US can go a long way. Being taught on a course can go a long way because it's a cumulative effect, really. And also, any book from languages that are not very, that are underrepresented. The first edition, only a couple of thousand copies will be printed. So if this sells out, then the second edition, third edition sells out, then obviously this publisher will realize, okay, I think there's a readership for this book. And then if you go to them with the next project, or go to someone else with the next project, they've heard about this, it will make life easier for the team. I myself, part of me is this idealistic person who says art for art's sake, don't get involved in any of that, but there's a reality that this is how the industry works. And if you don't have any reviews, if you don't have any academic papers, if people don't know about it, obviously it's not going to be read. And you want to spread the word, you want more people to read it, and so everyone can play a role, whether you are just a regular reader, whether you are a professor who studies, who teaches Middle Eastern literature, politics. There are so many different ways you can be part of the journey, if you like.
And so we can read the next book, which that could be the after. We'll grab some food and hear about the book that Karim was telling us, the next of Bakhtiar's books that takes place in Turkey, and has a very interesting plot and narrative structure. So, but first, I think a very warm and very appreciative round of applause